Hi, everyone. Welcome back to LaidOPEN Podcast. This is your host, Charna Cassell. I always do this. I wish my podcast could be a 3-hour conversation over tea because the longer that I'm talking to my guests, the deeper we go, and I love depth. And this young person, she's only in her late 20s, but she has such a wealth of experience and depth to her. It's really beautiful. And it shows up in her book and the depth of research in her book and her background as a doula, her relationship to plants and herbal medicine, and her own exploration. And I can only imagine what a profound human she'll be in her 50s. Anyways, what I want to say about our guest is she's written a book. Her name is Gabrielle Felder. She's a writer, a data analyst, and abarisa. She's the author of the new book, The Five Blessings of Ifá, Reclaiming Black Futures Through Afro-Indigenous Spirituality. And this is a book for everyone. It's something she emphasizes repeatedly. It's not just for people who are Black. It's for anyone who wants to understand a greater context and anyone who's had the experience of being disconnected from their ancestral land, their ancestors, and the wisdom that comes with and through that. And so I hope you read this book and that you use it as inspiration to connect to your own ancestry and have some important conversations. Welcome, Gabby.
Learn how to live embodied. Your life is about to unwind. Uncover new tools and start healing. Leave trauma and tension behind. Isn't it great laid open? Let all your desires come true. How can you live laid open? Imagine yourself brand new. Imagine yourself brand new.
I'm so glad to get to have you here and dive into your book. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. But yeah, it feels crazy to write a book. I feel like I've told people that it hasn't really sunk in yet. It kind of feels like a really big homework assignment. And I'm like, oh, just turned in that essay. But it's much, much more than that.
No, it's massive. I mean, I'm actually curious how long you spent, because there's the actual writing, but there's the inspiration for the book itself. And so it was gestating in you, I imagine, for a while before you decided this was a project that you needed to take out into the world. And so how did that unfold for you?
I would say the whole process was probably a 5-year long process. And then in terms of the actual okay, I'm actually in conversation about writing a book and turning this into something tangible, probably about a three-year process from there. And well, sitting down hardcore focused writing, I would say was 8 months, because I'm a procrastinator. So I feel like I was collecting information over the years and writing little essays and writing different things down, but putting it all together into a fully fleshed out book that flows from chapter to chapter. I did the majority of that in 8 months. It was a big push.
You're almost like the length of a birth, a pregnancy, right? I mean, but even so, 8 months is nothing.
Yeah.
One of the things that you share in your book is that you started writing this and you were keeping the writing from your family and the topic of the book. And, that you were raised in a very Christian household and that you were in questions around your own sexuality. So there was a certain amount, it sounds like, that you had to hide.
Yeah.
And that you weren't sharing and exposing and being celebrated inside your family. And if you could share more about what that experience was like and where you're at now with your family and the book.
Yeah. So I didn't tell my family I was writing a book until I had already submitted the final manuscript for it, and it was like, basically it was done. It was just like, we're going to work on the cover art and put it out. So it was like, I don't know, 6, 8 months before the actual book came out, but all of the writing was done. It was already turned in. I mentioned it, and I think I downplayed it a lot. I was like, I'm kind of writing something, and they know that I write, and they're like, okay, like, cool. So I don't think they really realized until things started coming out more, like until like the book was posted online, and like I had events that I was gonna do, and so then I feel like it started to hit them that I actually like wrote something, I guess, legitimate to them, for lack of a better word. But yeah, that was an interesting time in my life. And I think honestly, part of the reason why the writing process was so sporadic is because I had a lot of like anxiety about writing it in general. I was like, I know these things to be true to me. Like, this is my experience, my perspective. Like, I've done a lot of research, like, as well, to try to make sure that everything I'm putting in the book is as accurate as I can get it to be, but having caveats where it's necessary to have those. But I had so much anxiety because of a lot of different factors. But I think the main one was like, I don't know how my parents are going to respond. And not just my parents, but like my extended relatives as well. Because I think that my parents, ultimately, I think my parents are used to me doing things that they don't necessarily approve of. And they're like, okay, I guess this is just like what it's going to be. Like, there's like a period of time where they're upset and then they'll kind of get over it. My extended family is where things get more messy and complicated, because I think that my parents care obviously a lot about what my extended family thinks. And so if they're saying information about me, it's going to reignite the sort of like anger that my parents feel about the decisions that I make. So that whole family package altogether, I was like, is stressful. But there's also like a difference too between my mom and my dad and how both of them approach different things. They're both very, very deeply religious Baptist people, but my dad is much more like interested, I think, in just African culture generally. So I feel like from that perspective, I was like, I think he's going to connect to this anyways. And I think he's going to be interested in general because he's kind of like the family historian. So he's the one who would go through, and he got like the ancestry.com subscription like way, way early. And he would like map out all of our family trees. And he's always sending me pictures of different relatives, buying different books. And he's borrowed some books from me. So he's like very much interested in like Black history in general. So I felt like, okay, he's going to have something in this book that would be of interest to him anyways. My mom, not as much. And so that was like a little stressful, but they came to an event that I did at a bookstore in Los Angeles at Reparations Club. And the conversation partner I had for that event, she was like going very in on like, okay, we're going to talk about Marxism, we're going to talk about colonialism, we're going to talk about queerness. And luckily, where my parents were sitting in the audience, I couldn't see them. They were right up front, but they were kind of off in my periphery. So I was like, if I just pretend like they're not there, then I think I can speak the way I would typically speak. And I've spoken at different events and things like that in the past for a variety of different things besides this book, but my parents had never seen me speak before. So it was like a weird combination of things, but afterwards they were very, very excited, very proud. My dad was like, I told you about Denmark Vesey and all these other historical figures. Like, I mentioned this, I mentioned that. I think they're happy ultimately because I think they're happy that I've written a book, and I think they acknowledge that that is like an accomplishment. I don't know if they will read it. I think my dad has like read sections of it. I don't know if my mom will read it, and I don't know if anybody else in my family is going to read it.
Wow. It's, I have so many friends that have grown children that they just promote and celebrate. And it, it moves me to tears every time I see it, because it's tricky when, I write memoir and yeah, I don't think my parents will read that material or they haven't responded. They don't listen to my podcast, that kind of thing. And it matters to have the support of family. And at the same time, especially when you're queer, there's chosen family. right? Chosen community. So you have your actual biological extended family, but you have, I hope, a bigger family as well. And so do you feel like you're being celebrated by your people?
Yeah, I definitely think I am. And I feel like everyone else is reminding me how big of a deal it is to write a book, because I think that like I feel like I blacked out almost during the writing process, because like I said, I did a lot of it in like a kind of short time frame. And so I feel like I was just in this like flow state, for lack of a better word. I was just writing, and then I was done. And then I was like, okay, like what thing? And so my friends are very much like, you wrote a book, like,
It's
and I
huge.
secret from a lot of people. I didn't really tell, I only told 3 friends until basically the book was about to come out. And I worked at 2 bookstores doing events. And so my coworkers at bookstores were like, Gabby, did you write a book? Because we're seeing your book like in this catalog. Like, what is going on? And I'm like, I forgot to mention I did write a book. So yeah, it was crazy. My friend, how did you keep this from?
But I think it's really interesting, and I can't help but ask, how does that mirror your coming out process around your sexual identity? And the reality is that writing a book, the writing process versus the like reading publicly or speaking publicly, there is a coming out
Yeah.
that, is a physical experience in the body. I mean, like that's a lot. It's a lot to process. It's a lot to feel. And
No, it was very vulnerable. And I think that that is like actually a very good analogy for my coming out process, because it was very similar, where it was like I told only a few friends, and then eventually other people knew, and some people found out, and like more, I don't know the word for it, but more like, oh, okay, like shocking, I guess, sort of ways. And then I told my parents way, way, way later on. So it was like kind of the same sort of pattern. But yeah, writing something is so vulnerable. And I think especially when you're writing about spirituality, and when it's like a not organized religion as well, where it doesn't have this sort of text the way that like Christianity, for example, has the Bible, and you can just reference the Bible. And I know that there's lots of interpretations, but it is written down essentially. When it's something that is much more amorphous, it felt more stressful, because people are going to be like, well, my Eli does it differently, or I was taught differently. And so I was trying to reference as much information as I could to give like a full picture, but to also say like there are going to be cultural and geographic differences to how
absolutely
practice this, because it is something that I think has been misrepresented so much, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't contribute to any sort of misrepresentation.
Yeah, it's so tricky, right? I mean, I was telling you offline that one of my first spiritual teachers was a Yoruba priestess, and she's Cuban. She's coming, she's coming from a different geographical location, and so Puerto Rican and Cuban, and so this is like, to be clear, you've written a very specific book, researched around a very, certain continent and working with it in a certain context. And your teacher, just like so many things, depending on like how something has come down from the person you're working with versus someone else is working with, it's also it's an oral tradition, right? So it's like, it's not like there's something that's like, wow, this is what you do it. In terms of reference. One of the things that I'm very curious about is how writing the book has evolved your own relationship to your ancestors.
Yeah, I think that that process was something that kind of also delayed the finished product of the book too, because as I started on this entire spiritual journey, I had a lot of like gaps, I feel like, at least in my own personal understanding of my own family background as it ties to the United States. So both of my parents are African American, and both of their parents are originally from the South. So that essentially means that there's no one in my family that has any memory or knowledge or connection to anyone outside of the United States. So I don't have relatives that I can look to in West Africa or the Caribbean or some other place that's not located within the US. And I think that growing up that was really tricky for me to deal with, because I think being a Black person in the United States, you have such a complicated relationship with this country. And also specifically growing up where I did in Orange County, it's very not diverse place at all.
Boy.
My cousins and I were essentially one of the few Black people at our schools growing up, from elementary school through high school. So I think that when I was writing this book, I wanted to make sure that I dedicated time to go to the South and visit the South. And first I went to Louisiana and I just did like a lot of historical stuff there. My dad's mom has relatives from Louisiana. So that kind of helped me see the place a little bit more and like visualize it, because up until that point, the South was just like a concept in my head. So it was nice to actually physically be there and see what it was like feel the climate. I got to tour Whitney Plantation, which is like a Black-owned plantation now. And so they have like a very honest perspective of what enslavement looks like in the South. So I got to do a lot of things like that. And then right around the time that I was finishing up the book, I went to Alabama and Georgia, and I visited my mom's side of the family for the first time. And my mom is one of 5 siblings, and my grandmother, I want to say, is 8, I want to say. So there is just like a really large family. So there were cousins that I had met a couple of times, but it had been like 15, 20 years since I had seen a lot of these people. And it was just like so much food and so much culture, and like just cool to actually like put names to faces, and everybody knows who I am, but I don't know who any of these other people are. And so it was a really fun experience, and I'm glad I got to do that as well with my brother. But that, like, being actually tied and located into a place where I'm like, okay, this is where my grandparents lived and their relatives, and like specifically in Alabama, both sets of my grandparents, my mother's mom and dad, I should say, grew up in the same town and were neighbors like basically their whole lives. And so seeing that town and like the amount of history that my family has contributed to it was like important for me. Be rooted and located like geographically in a place that's tied to my ancestors. And I think it's given me a better appreciation, I think, for the specific Black American experience, because I think that, like I said, growing up, it was challenging to feel rooted or connected to that, because I didn't live in a place that really had any tie to my family in any way. Like, my parents grew up in Los Angeles, but I wasn't living in Los Angeles. Like, we didn't visit the South where my grandparents were from. So it was nice to kind of go and like trace that journey back.
Thank you. And the other thing that I share with you is I'm a gardener and love anything plants and herbs and food. And so I was picturing you visiting family, and also, you mentioned the climate there. And so I was curious about that, about how it felt to be physically like on the land, if you had a somatic experience of connecting, even though that was not necessarily like, like deep ancestral, but that's what you said, your family contributed to this town. And so what was it like to put your body there?
Yeah, no, I think it was very interesting. I think so. First in Louisiana, when I went, I was struck by how sticky and humid it was. And I love the humidity, but I was like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine like living in Louisiana, working on a plantation, sharecropping in this humidity. Like, made it much more tangible to me to be like, okay, this was like, obviously it was a difficult labor, but like just the heat alone, like the air doesn't move. It was just like sticky and like it just kind of set. And so that was an eye-opening experience for me. And then when we went to Alabama and Georgia, it was like, I want to say it was like March maybe. So it was kind of spring, kind of muggy, gray, wet, damp. But I was like just looking out, like we were driving around a lot, and it's so much like flat land. it's so much trees. Like you could just, it just was stretched out for miles and miles and miles, which I live in Los Angeles right now. You don't see just a lot of trees and land just stretching out like far. And it wasn't, being in California, there's hills everywhere. So it was so flat. It was just, yeah, it was a very interesting experience to be like, okay, this is the country that my family is from. Like it feels like a very completely different place. And when I was in Louisiana, I was in New Orleans. So that's like a very specific type of cultural experience. It's like a lot of food and city life and a lot of other stuff. But when I was in Alabama, we were in a teeny tiny town of Union Springs, Alabama. It was like really, really small. My brother was like, there's nobody here. Like, we went to a church service and everybody in the church was just my relatives. Like, there was basically nobody else in the town. It was so bizarre to see that. So I was talking to my cousins who were around my age, and they're like, where do you live? And at the time I was like, oh yeah, I live in this part of Los Angeles. And they're like, you're like in the city. Like, I was like, yeah. So there was vastly different experiences, but I felt like I was able to like put faces to names a lot too. And I fortunately was able to meet one of my grandmother's, one of her oldest brothers, who was like 90 at the time. And I remember hearing stories about him as a child. So putting all of that together and being like, okay, this is where my grandmother would get the peanuts that her family would send her, because they would ship her peanuts and snap peas. Then I would like sit on the floor with her while she would like roast the peanuts and snap the peas and things like that for dinner. So it was like, okay, I can see where things are coming from. Everything became like actually tangible and not just like a story in my head.
Yeah. And there's something so important, like the difference between reading a book about something and then putting your body into the practice of it, or hearing stories about a place and putting your body in I mean, when you described the air and the reality of like, okay, so slaves were working in this oppressive. So not only was it an oppressive system, but it was like oppressive in terms of the climate, right? Like there was a lot of struggle in a variety of different ways. There's wisdom that comes from it in a way that you can't get from just reading a book or hearing a story. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I also, as you were describing that, I was thinking about just I'd like to get into some of the material about your book and about Ifá and one of the things that, you know, the notion that godliness is inside of us and runs through everything, right? Mm-hmm. Versus this notion that there's like this singular being that rules and tells you what to do or something. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't raised with religion. And mm-hmm. so I have very little experience with that. But mm-hmm. I used to go to a non-denominational church that mm-hmm. was very queer and very Black and metaphysical, right? Mm-hmm. It was basically just like we acknowledged that energy ran through everything and mm-hmm. everyone. And so for you, taking that, like I'm imagining you're already in this practice and you already have, you know, you're writing this book and you're on this land. And then how did that inform what you were witnessing and what you were experiencing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the like land and the people specifically was, I'm trying to think of like the right way to phrase it. Like, I think that there was something like electric, I would say, about the whole experience. Mm-hmm. Because I think that my perspective in general is to start with the land. Like that's where you start in terms of understanding. And when you are someone from the United States, you're always on Indigenous land. So from that place alone, coming to this understanding of like, there were people who lived here even before my ancestors lived here, and they still live here. So thinking about like the connection between Indigenous American history and Black history, and then colonialism, and how all of that is like tied specifically to the land was like very powerful for me. And I tried to do as much information, do as much research on that as possible, especially while I was in Louisiana. And so I got a chance to look and visit the Mississippi River while I was there. And that river is so massive. It's so big. It's so powerful. and it has transported so much like goods, people, information, resources, just like back and forth for thousands and thousands of years. And in Ifá, the river is Oshun. So I remember I went to the river, I sang a song for Oshun, but then I also just thought about like, okay, Mississippi is an indigenous term. Like this river was used to transport enslaved people up and down the coast. Like people also used it to escape. Like how much has this river seen of like American history, you know? So the place where I was standing too, it had like a plaque talking about all of the different indigenous tribes of African peoples who came to the Americas as part of the enslavement. And so they named some of the various tribes. And so just thinking about the rich cultural diversity has like just in the American South alone, I think is not something that maybe it's not something that we don't talk about, but I wish that we like highlighted it more. There's so much cultural depth there. And then, of course, when you're in the South, you're going to eat food. So, like, that's also very much tied to the land. So, like, gumbos and fried fish and jambalaya, like, all of that comes from West African cuisine. But then they have ingredients that are mixed in from the Americas. So, it's like it's like a very perfect representation of this sort of like cultural diversity that is born from this place. And I think that sometimes in the US, we kind of do like a cultural flattening. Seem like the South is all one culture and Black culture is like all one culture in the United States, but it's very regionally specific. And it has so much influence from Europe and indigenous American culture as well that like you can't flatten it or separate them. It's all sort of like intertwined. And I think that specifically being at the Mississippi River was like a very visual representation of that for me.
When you started talking about the river, I mean, I'm still feeling it. My whole body, I'm like getting all these shivers. Like you were transmitting how moved you were being in the presence of that river. And I know also from your book, your connection to Oshun. Like, is that the god that feels the most resonant for you, or that you like? Do you want to say more to that?
Yeah, so the Ile that I'm a part of specifically, Oshun, is sort of, for lack of a better word, the patron of that Ile. The Orisha that owns my head would be, the term is Obatala, which is the Orisha of like knowledge and creativity. But they're obviously very interconnected in a lot of different ways, especially because water is sort of like an element of creativity. It's the thing that creates life. And so even though Obatala is over my head, Oshun is definitely a part of like, or like a representation of creative energy as well. But yeah, I think there's a huge, huge connection to Oshun, specifically because my Ile focuses a lot on Oshun as well. The sort of Baba of the Ile and a lot of the people in the Ile are children of Oshun. So there's a lot of Oshun energy. There's a lot of Oshun songs that we learn and things like that. So yeah.
One of the things I really appreciated your chapter on the Orishas as they relate to gender queerness, and talking about that notions of Oshun or notions of, from a Western perspective, there might be more thoughts and focuses on like beauty and love goddess versus actually she's a protector goddess, right? And that's deeply resonant for me. And if you could get into Oya as well, and the gender neutrality and and how important that is. Like, it's a gender neutral language.
Yeah, that I think was really fascinating to me in my research as well, and something that I wish like more people talked about in general, because Yoruba is a gender neutral language, but there's a lot of languages in West Africa that are gender neutral, and there's a lot of languages around the world that are gender neutral too. And so I think like as we're having this conversation in the West about like how do we use gender neutral language, like how do we incorporate gender inclusive pronouns, like other old languages have already done that. And it's sort of baseline how it is. And like to the point where I have friends whose parents are from West Africa, and they'll be like, yeah, sometimes my mom will mix up pronouns because it's not something that feels innate to them because it's not part of their language. So yeah, that I thought was like very interesting. And I think that it's a very like you lead with like the person. It's a very person-centered way of viewing the world, and language definitely shapes how you see things. Like whatever language you speak informs the world that you're living in and the world that you see, because if you don't have words to explain something, then it almost doesn't exist to you. So if you don't have words that are always denoting gender, then it's something that is like of lesser importance. So it's not like it wasn't important, and it's not like there weren't gender divisions within West African society, but it wasn't like the primary way of organizing groups of people. And then it's not something that it's not something that was seen as like as tied to biology as well, the way that it is in the West. It's more like you have a particular role during reproduction, and that's kind of it. The rest of your life is kind of up to interpretation. And so I think you can see that very clearly within the Orishas as well. So Olodumare, the creator, is gender neutral. Olodumare doesn't have a gender. And I think that sometimes in the West, when people have like artistic representations of Olodumare, they might gender Olodumare at that point, but there's no gender tied in the word or the meaning or any element of Olodumare. So the creator itself is this like gender neutral concept. And then when you get into like Oshun and Obatala and Oya specifically, like all three of them have these sort of non-Western traditional concepts and modes of gender. Obatala specifically, there's two paths to Obatala, like a masculine and a feminine path. So essentially Obatala could manifest as one or the other. Oshun is a warrior. A lot of women, goddesses, female goddesses in Ifá are warriors in general, specifically because motherhood is seen as kind of like a way of ushering you into like a type of warrior role, because you become a protector of your family, of your children, etc. And so Oya specifically, she goes into battle a lot, and when she battles, she transforms her gender. And so she will put on the beard and the clothes of men to go into battle. And so it's like gender is used as like a tool for her, specifically for like wartime. And it's interesting because she, in different mythologies and in different stories, she's also helped transform her partner's gender, Shango, and disguised him as a woman by braiding his hair at certain times. So there's a kind of gender like ambivalence that happens. And even if the Orishas or even if people feel that the Orishas are more rooted in a particular gender, there's countless stories of them putting on the clothing of another gender for XYZ purpose, or doing something to like hide in this way. So they're going to transform their gender. They need to use this as a tool, etc. And so it's not something that is like, it doesn't have like the connotations that we have in the West where it's transgressive to put on the clothing of another gender or to step into another gender momentarily. It's just part of life, and it's part play, developing a better understanding of yourself and other people, and just like generally like the world around you. And I think that is a huge part of Yoruba spirituality in general, even during spiritual possession, for example. So when trance and possession happens during ceremony, whatever Orisha comes down and takes over your body during those moments, you become that Orisha's gender. You get to transform into another gender. And I think that is like, it provides an opportunity for that sort of gender play and that gender expansion and experience in a controlled setting as well, and like a very socially acceptable setting. And so that's also just baked in to like Yoruba life and culture, is like the ability to have these moments where you get to transform into different genders and try different things on.
Yeah. There's even pragmatism in it, right? You're like, this is what would serve this moment.
Right.
Right. And removing the fear and the judgment. There is a quote that I wrote down. Oh, yeah. Nina Simone saying freedom is that absence of fear, systems that reduce anxiety and bring inner peace. And I wrote that down. I thought that was a potent, I'm trying to remember where in the book that was coming. Was that when you were talking about acts of rebellion? Do you recall?
I think that is.
I really appreciated that section, because I think I talk a lot with my clients about micro practices, micro celebrations, you know, and you talk about small victories.
Yeah.
You have a whole chapter on victories and so small acts of rebellion, and I'm thinking about that as it relates to what's happening in the world and all like big acts of rebellion, but also how can we do it in small ways, whether it's church or whether it's spiritual practice, how that has really served to create inner solace and inner peace in the face of oppression and fear, and how it helps people manage that.
I'm glad that you bring that up because I think it's incredibly timely to talk about small acts of rebellion. And that chapter, I think all the chapters I wrote were honest, but I think that chapter I felt very vulnerable to me as well, because in my own process of I don't know the word for it, social justice, for lack of a better word, social activism. I feel like there has to be a better word than that at this point. But on my journey of being someone who is like involved politically and informed politically and trying to figure out what my role is in society, I definitely hit a point sometime in like maybe 2022, feeling very low and very depressed and very like hopeless, because I think this was like a couple years after George Floyd's murder, where we had the sort of quote unquote racial reckoning. And I think I was in my early 20s at that point, like just coming out of my first master's program. And so I feel like I had this still kind of like young student oriented brain where I was like, we're going to change the whole world like right now, like everything's going to be different. And then feeling like things kind of just went back to normal was demoralizing. And so I didn't really know, like, okay, well, I feel like I spent all of this time and mental energy, and I think it didn't help being in the pandemic and being glued to your phone during that time period either, because you're just consuming so much violence through the phone and feeling like this weird disconnect, but it's still emotionally like hitting you. It was just like a very chaotic time. And then coming out of that to feel like, okay, it's, you know, the pandemic is quote unquote over. We're going back to how things were. It felt very demoralizing. And I was like, I don't really know how people deal with going through these sort of social movements and then feeling like they're not going anywhere. Like, I don't know how this is like a sustainable practice. And I read a book that I think really helped me reframe that perspective, called Joyful Militancy by, I want to say, Nick Montgomery and Carla Bergman, I think are the authors. And that was specifically about leaning into community and leaning into the joy in co-creating a new world together. Like, you have to find joy, and it can't just be these large moments and these large acts of protest, because there's all of these other little tiny things that you're doing along the process. And at the same time that I read that book, I read This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. I'm forgetting the author's name, but it's a really, really great book that talks specifically about the civil rights movement within the U.S. The author, whose name is escaping me, he played a huge role in the civil rights. So he was like actually there himself. And getting that perspective, you see like, okay, so you had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee doing this, and you had CORE doing that, and then you had these Black families in the South doing this, but then you had people, university students over here doing that. And so everybody was doing something different, and it was all very coordinated around like voter registration, getting people into the polls, doing sit-ins. Like, they had specific things that they were like, that their goals were, but the tactics varied and were different. And people had to celebrate like, okay, we got like X amount of people registered to vote in this town, or we had like a successful sit-in. It wasn't like this huge like March on Washington, for example. It was a lot of really small things that happened, coordinated efforts across the South and across the North that like slowly brought about change. And it was like all of these tiny little battles that people were doing. And then outside of the actual like the sit-ins or the voter registration, it was a lot of just like relationship building. Like, people are in relationships with each other. And so that perspective is like, okay, these are all little acts of victory. Like, it doesn't have to, you don't just have to focus necessarily on like winning this larger battle or having like this huge culmination of all of your efforts that be like the goalpost for victory. There are little slave rebellions that are acts of victory. There are large rebellions that are acts of victory. There are small things like more people exploring their own spiritual traditions as like a little act of victory. So I think right now in the current political moment that we're in, it's important to remember that like the small things count because that's what adds up. And also you never know, like through that relationship that you're building with someone, through that's maybe what you feel is like a smaller act, you don't know what the people that you're impacting are going to do with that energy that you're also transmitting out. So I'm a knitter and a crocheter. There's a lot of inherent political crafting practices that people are doing where people are like knitting and crocheting hats and things as acts of protest. And so you don't know what sharing a pattern or sharing a hat with someone is going to do, like where they're going to take that energy once you've passed it on. So I think that is what keeps us mentally and emotionally sustained when it feels like things are insurmountable and it feels like you're getting drained and bogged down. It's like, what's like a small thing that I can do to like work towards creating the world that I would like to live in?
There's so much that like, oh, we could go in like 17 different directions right now. Oh man. That last piece. What's interesting is I thought you were going to go somewhere else with it, but then you made it very concrete because there's the energetics, right? It's like what we put out into the world. It can be about a private practice that we're doing at home and shifting our energy. And then how do we energetically show up? And how do we then ripple out? And, the morphic field around our hearts impacts people, right?
Yeah.
It calms people, it activates people. But then the reality is like, we can concretize our intentions and our energy into food, into hats, into art, right? And yes, all of those, remembering the difference. It's hard, I think, to not get defeated. One of the things that you shared that I thought was really, I appreciated the honesty, is when you got burned out doing DEI work.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
and I really thought I was very curious about your process of self-acceptance through the process of writing this book, and the process of it takes a lot of vulnerability and self-acceptance to acknowledge, like, you're like, I don't identify as an activist. That's not necessarily who I figured out that I am. So your small acts of rebellion may come in the form of making a hat and putting it out into the world, or researching and reading and putting this book out to educate people. And I think it's important for us to not, like, I'm someone who feels everybody through my own physical body, and it's very intense and a lot. And so to put my body, I used to protest as a younger person, and I've come to realize, like, even just sitting in a small group of people, I'm processing what's happening in the room through my body, whether I like it or not. It just still happens. And so recognizing, what are our strengths? What are our edges? What do we want? Like, how do we want to give back and be of service?
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important. And I think that it's really easy to feel like there's only one pathway forward. Like there's only one role that we can do and everybody has to do the exact same role. And that's just not true. Back in my DEI trainer days, there was this chart that people were using in training spaces. And it was basically like, it was like a circle with a lot of other circles attached to it. And it was like a bunch of different roles. So you could be like a storyteller or a weaver or a this or that. And that's kind of how I see myself fitting into the political landscape and like what I feel like my gifts are and how I can contribute.
Mm-hmm.
I also try to watch a lot of interviews and documentaries with people that I think are incredibly intelligent that I look up to. And one of those people is Toni Morrison. And there's a really, really great documentary about her life. I want to say on Hulu or something like that. And she's in the documentary speaking as well. And she talks about how she was working in publishing at Penguin Random House, and she decided to reach out to Angela Davis to publish her autobiography. And she was like, I'm not necessarily going to be the person that's going to be like on the front lines of a protest, but this is how I'm going to contribute is in my role at Penguin Random House, I'm going to get Angela Davis's autobiography. I'm going to encourage her to write this and I'm going to acquire this book. And so through her work at Penguin Random House, she helped usher in so many Black authors, like, so that we're able to now read those stories today. And so I think that was really inspiring to me because I'm like, there's other things that I can do. There's other roles that I can play where I don't have to necessarily, there's more acts of protest than the traditional form of protesting, I guess. So it's not like it's not a protest. It's just in a different form. And so when I was writing this book, I was like, I'm trying to bring more healing and understanding to a specific group of people that has been denied access to their traditional religions for thousands and thousands of years at this point. And regardless of what, it was never meant to encourage people to practice Ifá or anything like that, but so that people have more understanding of how all of this plays a role in our lives culturally. And I want not just Black folks to read it, I want everyone to read it. I want people to understand like the beauty of West African traditions and how they're impacting all of us. If you live in a place with Black people, these cultures are rippling out, influencing all of us. And so I was like, that's the role that I can play. I can be like one voice that hopefully people who are on their own spiritual journey will find this book and take something from it.
Oh, thank you so much. That was beautiful. Feels like we're in an era of Shango in terms of destruction and rebuilding, and hopefully different than what happened with COVID, which is like, I think a lot of people had that hope of like, oh, it's going to be different when we come out. We're going to be more sensitized. We're going to be more connected. We're going to care about each other more. And then things just kind of went back to normal in a weird way. And feels like we're on the precipice of complete destruction.
Yeah.
For lack of a better word, but the creator destroyer. And in an ideal world, we'll see. I mean, we'll see what happens, but kind of rebuilding post-colonial and more in a more collaborative era, and like a power with era versus this kind of structure. And so, what are your thoughts as you're watching what's happening in the world, and with your knowledge and awareness from a spiritual perspective?
Yeah, I think that we have to, it's hard, but I think that you have to remind yourself that empires are made to fall. They don't last forever. Nothing lasts forever. Even if it's not going to happen right now, it will happen at some point because that's just the natural order of things. Societies rise and they fall. Like people come into power and they come out of power. Systems will change. And I think in Parable of the Sower, Octavia Butler very, very clearly hammers home the point that the only thing that you can count on is that things are going to change. That is what is evident, is that things are going to shift. And I think that reigns true in Ifá as well. Like there is this deep understanding of like the constant flux of nature and things shifting and things changing, whether it's cyclical or whether it feels kind of sudden. So like you can expect that after spring will come summer, but you might not necessarily expect when like a hurricane is going to come or a wildfire or something like that. That's just kind of the nature of the world that we live in, is that things are going to change and be disrupted. And that's an uncomfortable process, but the best thing that we can do for ourselves is to be prepared for that. So I think that obviously as humans, we have a natural tendency to want to be comfortable and to seek comfort and to kind of put the blinders up and be like, well, I have like my little house and I have my job and like that's all I need to focus on right now. But all of those things are in flux and all of those things can change at any moment. And that's not to be afraid of it. It's to be like, okay, well, then how do I prepare myself? If XYZ were to happen, what is my contingency plan? And I think that as people were really bad with coming up with contingency plans, and I think that even in Ifá, we try to use divination as a way of coming up with contingency plans, of getting more insight into the future. Of like, okay, well, if I don't do XYZ, then maybe, I might have like this certain misfortune or something might hit my life. So let me take heed and, consult a babalawo for divination. So it's a way of trying to set up contingency plans and to try and like figure out workarounds. And I think that right now we're in the the eye of the storm, essentially. Like the collapse of empire is like happening around us, and not just in the United States, but all around the world. Like, old systems are falling, and it's our job to figure out what's going to take its place, because just because something falls, it doesn't mean that the thing that takes its place is better necessarily. So there's this tension in this battle, I think, right now for like what is going to take the place of the old system, because the way that the United States is running currently does not feel like the United States of my childhood, and I'm in my late 20s. So it really hasn't been that long to see this amount of change happen. And so I think that those of us who care deeply about community and being in community with each other and building a world that is like truly just and welcoming for everyone, we have to be much more organized and much more strategic about the roles that we're playing and how we're going to usher in like a new world. And I think that the part that sometimes gets lost in this political moment is I think that sometimes we're too reactionary and we're not as thought out about like what's the strategy. And I think that in reading that book, This Nonviolent Self Will Get You Killed, you see the amount of organizing that people had to do to create the civil rights movement. I think we hear about like the Montgomery bus boycott, we hear about the March on Washington, but there was so much political organization that was happening across the country, a lot of it led by college students and church leaders and community members, but it was so much political organization and so much education too. Like people were really dedicated to learning from Dr. King, to learning from the Black Panthers, to like reading information, whatever strategy or tactic that they believed in, they were invested in learning about the principles of that. And I think we have to get back to that, where we're focused on how much information can we absorb, and then how can we organize ourselves together and then prepare ourselves mentally, emotionally, and spiritually for whatever change is going to come.
Absolutely. And along those lines, are there any specific energetic or spiritual protection rituals that you engage in, or that you would, that you can offer? There's so many, right? And obviously not everything is for everyone. But I think that a lot of people feel very unsafe and afraid. And I mean, there's them being physically paralyzed, but then also just like how to feel safe enough inside yourself and in your realm so that you can step outside of yourself and actually support others.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I feel like one of the main things that I try to do, and I kind of think of it as like spiritual hygiene, is cleanses, like regular like energetic cleanses, because I'm also a person that like gets very emotionally like bogged down by other people's energies. Like I can feel it. It almost feels like tangible to me when I'm in a room with someone else. If like they're in a good mood or a bad mood, I pick it up. And so if you're going to a protest, if you are like, even if it's like a book club, any sort of like meeting with other people, and you're talking about like really heavy topics or dealing with really heavy energy, you're going to carry that home like on your body. And sometimes you can channel that into something else. Like you can use that energy to propel you forward, but oftentimes it bogs you down and it feels really draining. And so typically I'll make like spiritual baths, and I'll take spiritual baths regularly. And Ifá, there are like particular herbs and things that like will be part of spiritual baths. But sometimes you can just like, if you wanted to do like a really, really quick, simple one, like a little bit of Florida water and some water and like maybe some white flowers, and rinse it over your head. Another thing that a lot of practitioners in West African spiritual traditions will do is wear white. Like you wear a very like reflective color, so it also helps like bounce energy off of you so that you're not holding on to stuff. And then wrapping your ori, because your head is like a sort of channel where a lot of things can like come into your head physically. So if you're going through a really emotional time, or like I said, you're trying to protect your energy, wrapping your head up a lot. So like if you want to be like cute with it, like wear like a bandana or like a cute little head wrap or something. And then not letting everybody touch your head or your hair in general, because that's also just like energy transfer of people. So protecting like your physical space too. And then yeah, wearing colors that helps like bounce some of that back. So lighter colors can help a lot.
I mean, there's so much that we didn't get to talk about herbal medicine and food justice and so many other things that are in this book. I really recommend that people read this book. It is chock full. It is so well researched, and there's so much heart in it, and it's really beautiful. Anything else that you want to say before we wrap up and before you share how people can get in touch with you?
Yeah, I guess the last thing that I would say is I would encourage everyone, regardless of their backgrounds, to do some digging into their family history and just to learn more about the practices of their ancestors, just in general. I think that a lot of times in the West, we can become really disconnected from our roots, especially in the US, because the sort of myths of settler colonialism ask us to kind of recreate ourselves as American, but all of us, unless we're Indigenous American, came from someplace else. And so if we can connect back to what those practices were, whether they're spiritual traditions or cultural traditions, that is the thing that gives us our sense of humanity and ties us back to people for generations. So I would encourage everyone to do more research into their own family histories, and their own cultural practices, and to see what things resonate with you and what you might want to bring forward and carry on today.
Beautiful. Yay. Thank you. And how can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram. My Instagram is at GFX_Prince, PRINTS. That's the only social media that I'm active on. I'm trying to
Good for
stay
you.
on apps. Yeah.
Oh boy. And yeah, so thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. If you appreciated this episode, please like, rate, and review it and share it with your friends. And if you would like to stay connected, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at LaidOPEN Podcast, LaidOPEN If you go to charnicacell.com, you can join my newsletter where you'll get discounts as well as find additional resources, and you'll be the first person to find out about upcoming events. Keep your eyes peeled for some workshops that I'll be offering monthly. At passionatelife.org, you can get more information about my private practice and my approach to healing. This has been LaidOPEN Podcast. I'm your host, Charna Cassell. We all have different capacities, but I believe in our capacity to grow and change together.